Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to A Healthy Food System for a Sustainable Future. This is the January monthly webinar being presented by the MIT Alumni Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network. For the past decade, our network has connected and informed alums about the status and interactions between the world's energy and environmental systems. Our second goal is to connect alums to collaborate and make progress toward a sustainable future and climate. Our webinar today looks at how today's food system impacts land, water, air, and ecosystems. That includes us, and even our economy. Our moderator and speakers will provide an overview and begin the conversation. There will be 15 to 20 minutes to cover questions live from our attendees. Please use the QA feature and raise your hand in the participant list. The chat has not been activated for you today. However, the panelists will be able to put key points or information into the chat for you to see. So with that, again, I welcome you and I introduce Andrea McGimsey, our moderator today, who works at Environment America and is their Senior Policy Director for Climate. I think I've got that right, but Andrea, it's up to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us today for this super important topic. My name is Andrea McGimsey. I'm the Senior Director of Global Warming Solutions for Environment America. At first, I want to introduce our two other speakers. Dr. Emily Moberg studied at MIT undergrad course 1E and then received her PhD from MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Joint Program in Biological Oceanography. That's a mouthful. Her research has ranged from economic models of fisheries to algorithms for measuring phytoplankton to historical studies of food system change. Currently, she works at the World Wildlife Fund as research lead specialist on Scope 3 carbon measurement and mitigation within the Markets Institute. She focuses on greenhouse gas mitigation within agricultural supply chains. And my document's not working. Okay. Jessica Toth has a master's from MIT Course 15 with her thesis on energy markets in Eastern Europe. She's the executive director of Solana Center for Environmental Innovation, an environmental education and consulting nonprofit serving the San Diego region. Solana Center and her job are at the interesting nexus of community behavior change, policy impact, climate science, and business management, as indicated by the diversity of recent awards. She's received the Outstanding Service in U.S. Composting Award in 2019, San Diego Emmys Unwasted Food in 2018, Top Businesswomen in San Diego in 2017, and California Governor's Environmental and Economic Leadership Award in 2016. So I'm so excited to hear what they have to say. We're going to start off with a 5-minute presentation from each of the speakers, then move into a series of questions that all pose, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And please put your questions in the Q&A window. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Emily Moberg.
Great, thank you.
Oh, Moberg, sorry, Emily.
No worries. It gave me a moment to get my screen shared there. So excited to be with this group again today, and I'm going to use my 5 minutes of intro to briefly talk about the intersection of agriculture and climate change, which the way I like to think about it, there are kind of 2 directions that we could look at this, and we're going to focus mostly on one of them today. The first is agriculture and food systems influence the climate in that there are emissions that are originate from agriculture, and there's also sequestration potential in agriculture. And then the other direction is that the change in climate itself influences agriculture and agricultural yield. And both of those are really, really critical, but I do find it's really helpful to make that distinction. So today, mostly focusing on the first of those 2 things. So when we talk about the food system and climate change in terms of emissions, the overall scope of this is really large. So the most recent IPCC report indicates that between 21 and 37% of the global total of greenhouse gas emissions originate from the food system. And this can come from a lot of different places. So I love this figure, which appeared in a meta-analysis in Science 2 years ago, which captures some of these different places that it comes from. So we can have land use change. So think about deforestation or the burning of biomass to prepare fields for the next season. That releases a lot of carbon both from biomass and from the soil. We can also have emissions from the soil itself during the planting process. So the application of nitrogen fertilizers and the microbial processes there can release nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. There are also emissions embedded in that fertilizer itself to produce it. There are also then emissions from on-farm machinery use, like tractors, or for other processes like greenhouse, cooling, irrigation, pumping, those types of processes. Then for, not relevant to all types of agriculture, but we may then have emissions from enteric fermentation from ruminants like cows, from ponds for different types of aquaculture. And there may also be emissions resulting from the decomposition of manure and other waste products. When we transition then out of the farm, there are emissions from the processing, so things like slaughter, things like actually milling different grains, as well as the packaging. So these are going to be more in terms of either waste products or an electricity use for that. And then finally, we also expect emissions from the transport of foods, as well as their storage. So think refrigeration at retail and consumer level, as well as potentially from the end consumption and preparation as well. And I'm just putting this up to note that often we categorize these as AFLU, so agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and non-AFLU, so industry, transport, and those types of buckets. AFLU is about a fifth of total emissions, and agriculture tends to be a lion's share of those, both from direct and land use change emissions, but there is also a significant, about 10% of the emissions are from these kind of more industrial and transport processes that we might not think of as agriculture. Again, these kind of electricity and transit type processes I mentioned. So the other thing I wanted to highlight, a part of this, is that foods have very different emissions intensities. So by the intensity, I just mean per kilogram of product. And I've also included these other land acidification, eutrophication, and water scarcity impacts. Down this vertical, you can see different commodities and how their greenhouse gas emissions intensities vary. So beef, we have a mean of 50, eggs, a mean of 4.2 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per 100 grams of protein. But also critically, within each commodity, there's a lot of variation. So for each of these cases, you can see these little distributions, which are showing then the range and frequency of these emissions. And you can see that there's a huge degree of variability, which both represents variation in production practices. And then I think on the optimistic side, the scope we have for decreasing emissions through better production practices. So that I think is another important thing to realize, is that it's both what you eat and how it was produced that are very, very critical to determining these emissions. And then finally, before I turn it over, just want to emphasize as well this kind of other side of the coin that I originally mentioned, which is that climate change also influences agriculture very strongly. The climate involves both temperature and precipitation, which are really critical for crop growth. And so I've shown just two plots here for corn growth in different regions with and without adaptation as the temperature changes. And you can see that there is a potentially large impact on yield, but this very much can change with the geography and crop that we're thinking about. So I think I've used up my 5 minutes, and I'm looking forward to the questions afterwards.
Great, and next we're gonna hear from Jessica Toth.
Okay. Let me share my screen. So thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. I am the director of Solana Center for Environmental Innovation. As Andrea mentioned, this is actually a dumpster of food that was in the back of a grocery store. So you can see we're throwing away a lot of potentially edible, if not edible, then still nutrient rich foods. So while Emily's talking very much about the production side, I'm very concerned about the disposal side of food and food waste. A little bit about Solana Center. I could go on, but I'm going to try and keep to my allotted time. We are a nonprofit in the San Diego area. We were founded in 1983, beginning with traditional recyclables. We have 3 pillars now: soil, water, and waste. We do a lot of composting education. We reach about 30,000 people annually. Some of that is intensive 5-week master composter classes. Some of it is hands-on hour-long workshops. Some of it is outreach about food waste prevention. We also have demonstration projects. These are some of my favorite pictures. In the upper left, this is kids at an actual school. They have a compost bin there. So teaching kids about the natural cycle of food, and that there are nutrients and minerals embedded in the foods that we eat. And if we discard those in the landfill, we lose those valuable nutrients. But we also teach that. In the upper right is a master composting class. And the bottom 2 photos are actually from a demonstration program that we had, where we did a 6-month project taking pre-consumer food waste from a fast food restaurant and turning it into nutrient-rich compost at a agriculture site that was less than a mile away. San Diego is a unique area in that we have commercial, residential, and agricultural sites in relative close proximity. So that was a win-win. We also participate in California is very progressive in this area. There's a healthy soils program. We provide technical assistance to farmers. In the last year, we provided almost $250,000 of assistance and grant funding through the state, which will be responsible for offsetting something like 35 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So again, trying to prevent organic material from going to landfill, but also working on the side of helping farmers with regenerative farming practices. I'm just going to put this up here. I'll probably come back to it a little bit later. If you haven't seen it before, the US EPA has a food hierarchy, and ideally, what you do is you look for opportunities to source, reduce food waste, and then feed people in need, feed animals, and as you can see, least preferable is to landfill organic material. My last slide is just to bring home the point that a lot of material is food waste, is food scrap is wasted at the household level. We have some tips later in the discussion about how you can reduce the amount of food that you're throwing out. But this equates to about 400 pounds of food per person annually. They say for a family of 4, that's $1,800 in your food bill. And I always encourage people to take the what I call the kitchen caddy challenge, which is if you set aside the amount of food for a week, even for a day, that you're throwing out, you'll be shocked. Everybody, including myself, would start the day by saying, we really don't throw that much away. But there's a lot of food waste that happens, and a lot of it's not edible. But just the image of having that all go to landfill is a climate change issue. And that's what I have for my slides. We'll turn it back to Andrea, I think. Let me figure out how to unshare my screen.
Okay, Thanks so much, Emily and Jessica. So I'm going to ask some questions so we can go a little deeper in some of the issues you've brought up. So Emily, for climate advocates, it's a well-known fact that eating a plant-based diet leads to far less greenhouse gas emissions than a meat-centered diet. But we Americans, we love our hamburgers. Moderate approach to this gnarly issue seems right to me. For instance, the Meatless Monday movement. And some are encouraging Americans to make at least one meal a day without animal-based food. And then, of course, there's the growing prevalence of plant products, like my favorite at the market is almond milk. And this is not a new notion. President Thomas Jefferson, who is known to be quite a foodie, apparently enjoyed his vegetables so much that he would get questions about being a vegetarian. And his response was, "I eat meat as a condiment to the vegetables which constitute my principal diet." So I like that notion of spicing my vegetables with meat instead of making it the main course. Could you share your thoughts on the impacts of following President Jefferson's lead and shifting our diets towards more plants and less meat, eating more food that comes from our backyard or down the street? And how might we best engage our fellow Americans in this?
Yeah, that's a really great topic and one that has been getting a lot of attention recently. There was a report last year called the Eat Lancet report that was particularly focused on looking at diets that were at the intersection of human health and planetary health and what those would look like. Also recognizing that the diets that we eat, particularly as Americans, are not necessarily particularly good for us in terms of non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease and others. So super, super relevant. Personally, I think that the components of diet and then how food is produced need to go hand in hand. And where it's produced, it's not a kind of either or. It's something that we need to take together in concert. And before I say anything else on that as well, I do want to specify that when we talk about diet, that it's really critical that we acknowledge that the diet we eat in the United States and many other high-income countries is very, very different from those in developing countries. And so when we talk about eating less meat, that is not necessarily appropriate at a global scale. The state of food insecurity that was just released last week by the FAO emphasized this point, which is that many developing countries may actually need to increase animal source protein production and consumption in order to meet nutrition goals, which would require a commensurate increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The flip side of that, very much to your point, Andrea, is that for higher income countries, that net decrease has to basically come from us for this. And I think there's a lot of potential in terms of both what we eat, and this can be both within animal source products. As you can see, there are different emissions factors for different types of animal source products and how those products are produced. Because the range of those emissions factors can be easily 10, often 100-fold. I think as a consumer, it's much easier for us to choose a product rather than choose how it was produced because we don't often have visibility into that. But that's definitely something that I think we need to be seeing as well on a systemic level as part of this. Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those actors. So I'll cut myself off there for now. And I don't think I really got into how we can engage with others on that.
Well, we've got a couple more minutes, I think, for your question, if you want to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's a really interesting question in terms of, we actually just, I'm working with some folks on a study in terms of how large-scale dietary change occurs. And I think the answer, perhaps frustratingly, is that it needs to be occurring on multiple scales. We need technology in terms of improving production practices for the things that are entering diet. We need supportive policies that allow these products to actually enter the market and be competitive when we're out shopping. We also need cultural change, which has often occurred both through governmental action as well as chefs have really been pioneering different types of food and introducing it in new ways, as well as often different types of market-based incentives that have occurred. And for historical change, we've seen the confluence of all of these is what really fundamentally changes diet, not any of these actors alone. But the caveat is they often do start small and then increase over time, or there's this little seed innovation that starts, and some of these other factors can pile on. So I think as individuals, when we're interested in getting involved in this, if there's a piece of this puzzle that you are drawn to or find interesting and excited about, talking with others and seeing how you can engage with it at maybe 1 or 2 levels up, whether that's at a city or regulatory level, talking to representatives, talking to folks, in different spaces is a good way to start moving that needle a little bit farther on that.
Great. Okay, Emily, second question for you. If we're going to solve the climate challenge, farmers and other professionals in the agricultural sector will play a crucial part, from sequestering more carbon in soil to working to decarbonize their farm operations. Can you speak to the role that the farming community, food distributors, and us as consumers of food have in addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I love about working on agriculture and food is because there are these really strong and important actions for each of those groups of actors in this. I know a lot of my colleagues love to say that agriculture is exciting because it's the only sector that really can contribute to climate solutions in a really fundamental way, because we're talking about biological systems that can sequester carbon. And so soil carbon, I don't know if folks on this call have heard about that, but it's basically the huge stock of carbon within the soils, whether it's right at the surface or much deeper down. That's an incredibly large stock, about 3 times larger than the atmospheric stock, in fact, but that has been historically depleted over the past couple of centuries. And there's a couple of win-wins there, in that in general for depleted soils, adding organic matter to those soils also increases fertility and yield. And there's evidence that a lot of practices ranging from cover cropping to no-till agriculture, things like regenerative or rotational grazing can be really effective in this as well. There are a lot of things that farmers can do to make really meaningful change in that carbon stock, as well as changing fertilizing practices to make sure that there isn't waste there. I think the really critical component as well for that, which is where some of these other actors become involved, is we don't necessarily have our incentives aligned for making that happen. So we're not necessarily paying producers for the environmental good that they may be doing if they are producing in a more climate friendly way, for example. So there's a lot of action that can be taken from some of these buyers, whether it's through long-term contracts or actually seeking producers that use these practices to encourage that, in addition to, we have a lot of inefficiency and emissions that occur in these other stages, whether it's processing or retail, that can be reduced as well. And I think I won't get into too much on the consumer side, because I think Jessica will talk a lot about that as well. But for consumers, I think food waste is one of the biggest ways that consumers can be engaged, because anytime food is wasted, all of those resources that we've talked about in terms of land, in terms of water, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, those emissions still exist, but we're not deriving any benefit from it.
Great. Okay, thanks so much. All right, I'm going to shift over to Jessica now. We have a terrible problem with food waste in this country. And I know I struggle with this myself as a single woman. I have to buy large portions because that's how they are packaged. And sometimes I just can't get through it all. Or frankly, sometimes I just forget about my favorite, the cucumber that got buried in the back of my fridge, because those are just the worst and the slimiest. I was going to actually bring a show and tell. I'm starting to keep a list of all the vegetables in my refrigerator so I don't forget about them. So what can we do besides a list on your fridge as individuals and as a society to stop wasting so much food?
Thank you. So that's something that's very important to us as environmental educators. Before I get into the specifics of what we can do as individuals, I find this very interesting, and given the audience, you may as well, something that Emily alluded to as well. There's differences in different parts of the region. So now again, we're talking about food loss and food waste, not necessarily agricultural processes, but where along the supply chain does food loss occur? And so consumption, being the red part, is about both retail and at the home. And as you see in the more developed countries, the majority of our food waste is happening in the household or at the retail. Now, that doesn't mean only that we're more wasteful. It also may mean that in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have the transportation networks and the refrigerated trucks and all of the types of things that we have. But just simply to make you aware that this type of research is out there. This was done by the World Resources Institute and the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization. So if anybody's interested in a deeper dive, I think it's a very interesting situation, in that wealthier regions have more consumer food loss. Again, this is 100%. It's a percentage based. It's not how much we waste per capita. That information's out there as well. I'm just going to remind you that there's the food recovery hierarchy, where in terms of what can we do as consumers, so the first thing you want to do is prevent that food waste. After that, it's to donate food. We work with restaurants to encourage them to set up food, to connect with food rescue organizations being like food pantries. Feeding animals, feeding cattle with bakery goods and pigs with other types of food, post-consumer food. Industrial uses includes anaerobic digestion, which turns food waste into primarily energy, but it also does have a digestate that can be composted. Composting is then on the list as well prior to getting to the landfill. And if we have time at the end, I'm interested in talking a little bit about what COVID has done to that whole pyramid. But to your question, which was how can we stop wasting food? There are definitely there's a lot of information out there, and I'm going to just hold up and tease you with the types of things that are available. There is a SaveTheFood.com website that was put together by the Ad Council and NRDC. I may be confusing that with all kinds of things about how to store your food, how to plan your meals, how to plan your shopping, and that type of thing. So you want to plan your meals in advance. You want to shop your kitchen first, see what's in your refrigerator and your pantry before you go out and start your shopping. Shop with a list. Store your food properly. And I have learned so much, and I continue to learn so much from our staff, and then also from just information that we learn. For example, storing asparagus in your refrigerator in a cup of water. Don't store it in a plastic bag. Put the ends in a cup of water and put it on a shelf. That prolongs its life. Proper way to store herbs and different, what fruits and vegetables not to store together. Understanding the dates, this has been quite a big issue at the state, local, and federal level. The sell-by date, the best-by date, and the use-by date are actually quite complicated, and the only one that's actually driven by the food itself and the healthiness of the food is baby formula. So for the most part, you can eat strawberries if they're a little bruised. You can put them in a smoothie, for example. Then you want to donate, and then finally compost. I'll go through this quickly because I'm getting the signal that I'm running out of time. So the implications of food waste and food loss are environmental. Food waste, when it ends up in the landfill, actually creates methane, methane and nitrous oxide, which are way more potent than the little bit of carbon dioxide that would be created from composting. Obviously uses land, water, and resources, energy. They're all wasted in the production of food that you may not eat. There's social justice issues that have to do with feeding, food insecure. In our region, 1 in 5 adults are food insecure. And just rescuing 10%, we throw away 500,000 tons of food waste every year in our region. Our region is about 3.6 million people. 10% of that food waste, not to say that all that food waste is edible, but 10% of it would feed the food insecure. Doesn't mean it would end hunger, which has other systemic issues. And then, of course, there's a financial issue. The cost of food waste is on the order of $25 billion just from restaurants, which can be as much as 4% of an average restaurant's sales. And I won't go through these details, and I can come back to it if there's interest, but avoid the benefits of composting and diverting. You're avoiding the greenhouse gas emissions from landfilling. You're conserving the land, water, and resources, retaining the intrinsic value that's in the food waste. So when we harvest food, we are harvesting the minerals and the nutrients that have been mined from the ground, just like when you mine aluminum to make an aluminum can. You throw that aluminum can in the landfill, you've lost those nutrients. Same thing happens with food waste. I've seen numbers such as, if we continue with the agricultural practices and the food waste practices we have today, we have 60 years of agriculture, farmable land remaining. And then compost application, Emily is very familiar with this, but I'm not sure that you went into much depth with it, but compost application sequesters carbon for up to 20 years into the soil, retains moisture. And our studies here in San Diego, we need about 40% less irrigation if we've applied compost to our gardens. And as I mentioned, it returns minerals and nutrients to the soil. And educating the next generation is a very important point to me. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'll let you go on with your next question. I'm sorry if I went over there.
That's okay, Jessica. You actually talked a lot about my next question, but okay. I'll ask it and see if you have anything else to say. Okay. So I'm fortunate to live in a home with a small backyard where I can compost my food scraps, and I use them to enhance the soil in my teeny little garden. But when I've lived in apartments in other towns, it was really hard for me because I didn't have a way to compost, and I had to throw the scraps in the trash, which I did not like doing. Environment America, which is my organization, published a report in 2019 on composting that said Americans landfilled or incinerated over 50 million tons of compostable waste in 2015. That's enough to fill a line of fully loaded 18-wheelers stretching from New York City to Los Angeles 10 times, which is just astonishing. And so my question was going to be, what are the benefits of composting to ourselves, our communities, and our planet? And can you address what we need to do to make composting available to all Americans?
So, the slide that's up, I think, hit at some of those points in terms of how to make it available to all Americans. We teach composting classes. We have very passionate advocates. We actually have a food waste drop-off program here. Even though we don't have curbside pickup in our area, many parts of the country do have curbside pickup for compostable waste. So we have many of the early adopters either composting at their own location or participating in our food waste program, food waste drop-off program. What's very interesting to me with the food waste drop-off program is they have to pay the participants. We have a waiting list. We have 150 people. People have to pay to participate, and they have the inconvenience of bringing the food waste to us. So we do have people who are really passionate, understand what the issues are. In fact, when we were closed in March because of COVID and didn't really want to take people's food waste on site here and process it, we had people calling us constantly, and they stockpiled their food waste. So I think this is one of my favorite slides, and I think for this audience it may be of particular interest. I borrowed from Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Because what we see with our the early adopters is that we have the chasm, and we're getting past those innovators who are doing it at home, the early adopters who are participating in community compost programs where they do a drop-off. But the real question is, how do you get across that big, scary chasm? And I think that's to the heart of your question. If you have food waste drop-off and organic material, not drop-off, but curbside pickup, please participate in it. Make sure you don't throw, other materials in there. It's a very important aspect of keeping the compostable material out of landfill and impact on climate change. There's some quote that goes around that says if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world, global emitter behind the United States and China of greenhouse gases. That's how much damage our food waste is doing when it ends up in the landfill. So the real question is, how do we get across that big, scary chasm to get the early majority and the rest of the community? I have this slide up. How am I doing for time? You want me to go into further detail with a food waste drop-off program?
Well, we're past time, so maybe wrap up in a minute.
Okay, I will just describe what we have with our food cycle program, where the consumers collect their food scrap at home in a bucket. We stockpile the sealed buckets. We build a compost pile. We manage and cure it for about 4 months. But you can see it's a very intensive process. And the problem that we're having in our region is that landfill tipping fees in our area are $45. So if you take a ton of waste and throw it in the landfill, just garbage, you're only going to get charged $45 for that ton. But the cost of processing food waste is on the order of $85 to $90 a ton. So later, if there's interest, I'd like to have a discussion on the importance of policy change and all the different levers. But I'm going to stop right there and stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you, Andrea.
Great. Okay. Well, I have one more question for you all, but I think I'm going to ask it at the end of the session and go to any questions we have from the audience. And again, thank you all for joining us. And if you have questions, you can put it in the Q&A window, which you can click on at the bottom of your screen. So
as your EESN host, may I ask a first question? I was wondering how much local farming and gardening can contribute to both saving energy and making healthier soil and saving food and money.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and there's a lot of factors here that one should think about in terms of, both our ecosystem of farmers, supporting small and local farmers. I think in terms of the data that suggests where impacts occur, most of the impacts actually aren't from transport. In many cases, you actually have much larger differences in emissions from how that production occurs relative to transport. So I remember a number that struck me so much was that India consumes or imports most of its lentils from Canada. And despite what may seem like a very large distance, the production efficiency in Canada is about 3 times more efficient than producing it locally. Therefore, the savings in terms of those environmental impacts by producing it in Canada are actually huge. And in many cases, you can see these similar differences in these production practices, some of which are related to geography and climate, and some of which are related to some of these practices that both Jessica and I have been talking about in terms of, are you using cover crops? Are you using compost? Are you using regenerative agricultural practices? And all of those sorts of things. Many local and smaller farmers may do much more integrated types of productions, doing what we call kind of like a polyculture or polycropping, where you're producing things together, which you would expect to see those benefits. But I think that the kind of local food needs to be part of a larger conversation about how we produce things, rather than just saying it's definitely better or it's definitely worse, because that's cutting out this huge, huge component of the story. And you know, harking back to that number that Jessica mentioned too about the food waste comprising such a huge component of global emissions, one of the reasons that number is so large is because that includes embedded emissions from the production. And there's a lot of work we can do to bring those production numbers down, in addition to cutting that food waste. So it's really, in my opinion, an and, because we really need all hands and all levers on deck to work on these emissions reductions to the scale that they need to be.
Great. Sarah, you're going to read out the questions, right? Or do you want me to do that?
Read them. The first question that came in was about, where to go? First question that came in about, it was about Emily's last slide. And it was a question from Maria about whether the last slide that you had shows that no adaptation results in a smaller reduction in yield than with adaptation in tropical areas.
Yeah, sorry, I think I got a little overzealous and answered in a written form as well to start. Basically, that is a little bit of an unclear case. There is much more data, and it also reflects to some extent the huge preponderance of where corn is grown, which is largely in the United States, in terms of where we have data for climate impacts and adaptation. So it's very much skewed towards the temperate regions. And the authors suggest that change in the adaptation may produce lower yields, maybe a statistical artifact of that small numbers. And they suggest that it's more reflective of the fact that there is no benefit from adaptation in those tropical regions, in particular where the temperature change is very, very high. But there's also very little data in those regions. So I think we can confidently say it's not a bump, but less confidently say it's actually a detraction in yield.
Right, and we have the most variability from climate in the temperate zones for temperatures for our crops also. The tropics are a heat increase, and I don't know that the weather actually is colder down in the tropics. Okay, another question from D. It's about expiration dates on food. It's a major cause of waste, which you said. Okay, so we want to, and this is, I guess, Jessica who covered this. We want to, but don't know how to make it happen. A suggestion was that we are supposed to freeze the waste until we have enough to justify moving it somewhere. And apparently Venice in Florida allows waste drop off at one place also. Good. So the question there was that expiration dates are a major cause of food waste. And is that something that we should be worried about and push?
There is legislation in California, and it's definitely been discussed. Maybe Emily knows the details. It's just eluding me right now at the national level in terms of standardizing the date labels. And it was identified by ReFed, which has done a lot of just tremendous research in this area. It was identified as sort of the low-hanging fruit to tackle food waste. So the most impactful piece of legislation that could pass would be to standardize date labels. It actually, I have read that it's a bigger problem at the grocer's level. That is that grocery stores are hesitant, of course, to sell anything that's past its quote, whatever date has been published there. So there are stories I remember reading of grocery store in Finland, where they would sell at a discount anything that was past its expiration date, but was still perfectly fine. So we have a big problem with it. I'm not sure that I'm answering your question. I mean, I think there's a great opportunity pass legislation to require the distributors and manufacturers to standardize and identify dates that are of more concern to people. But I think it's also at the consumer level to just recognize there's a lot of leeway there. Use your smell, your sense of smell and your sight to identify, if there's mold on it, okay. And that can happen before that sell-by date. Your nose can tell whether the milk has gone rancid, but you also can use still a lot of these products. Rancid milk can be used in, I've cooked with it and made muffins with it. And
buttermilk pancakes.
That's exactly right. So you can be quite creative and eliminate much of what you do throw away today. I'm not sure if that fully answered the question, but that's my best. Emily, do you have anything to add?
No, I think there was a kind of follow-up about just how we choose to purchase things and whether or not we're freezing and some of those types of practices, whether we're buying something that's frozen, which I know personally and from others in the organization, thinking blueberry pancakes with frozen blueberries works really great. And knowing myself, that's a change I've made because I know that otherwise they tend to to not survive the whole time in my fridge. So I think there are some creative ways to think about that as well that I know folks in the chat have been bringing up.
There's a specific question here about whether cows eating lemongrass don't burn methane. Are there some technologies and techniques that you're aware of that change some of the emissions from our food production?
Yeah, and the enteric methane production, ruminants in general, so we're talking about cows, organisms that actually are eating, in general, very heavy plant diets that we can't necessarily digest the same way and have this kind of secondary digestion process do produce a lot of methane. And there's a lot of interest and research into how the diets of those animals influence the amount of methane they produce. So there is differences in how much methane is produced between grass-fed cows and between cows that are fed a high grain diet. There is some evidence that some feed amendments, including algae, lemongrass, also reduce emissions. There are both some commercial products that are kind of, I think, winding their way through, the various kind of safety checks on that for these products, as well as a lot of studies to determine if those amendments are also consistent with the cows actually eating them, which is a big issue in some cases, and with cows growing at the same rate. In general, none of these amendments are going to give you 100% reduction, but some of the reductions are on the order of potentially a third of enteric methane production. So yeah,
so a third less
it is real.
A third less in beef is still more emission than pork or chicken. So that's kind of interesting. There also was a suggestion. I'm sorry, Andrea, Jessica, go ahead.
I have a funny anecdote. When I was actually at MIT, I did a project for Department of Energy, and they were looking at over Eastern Europe, I think it maybe was even particularly over Hungary, whether there was gas pipeline leaks because of variable, satellite images and sensing that they had, and it was cow flatulation that was being picked up. And so it is a significant problem. It can, and I think, we're now aware. So that was in 1991. So we're now aware of some of these issues and then the types of things that Emily's talking about. A third is a significant cut in emissions.
Also want to emphasize that the sort of enteric methane emissions, and for many of these products, you also have embedded emissions in feed, as well as emissions from manure, depending on what you're doing with that, either from that decomposition, if you're not using it for other beneficial use, as well as in many cases, for example, dairy, there's often very high electricity costs for refrigeration or potentially for other services for the animals. So it's not a third of all, it's a third of enteric methane.
Very good. I wanted to mention there was a comment that Google is very good on figuring out how to deal with rotten food and what kinds of cooking you can use. So that was a helpful thing. There's a lot of information out there. There's a couple more questions, but I know that Andrea had one that she wanted to try and finish with. So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much. I just wanted to comment on the Google thing. Make sure you're looking at a trusted source for that. So the Congressional Select Committee on the Climate Crisis recently put out a 500+ page report that's a roadmap for how Congress can lead on solving the climate crisis economy-wide, and it includes over 30 pages on agriculture. My favorite piece of that is I live in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is one of the fastest growing counties in America. It's 2/3 rural, and I've fought for many years to keep the farmland as farmland and not let it become more suburbs for the DC region. And that's one of their policy suggestions. So I'm wondering, I know you've had a chance to look at the report. What else do you think are powerful solutions that would result in the fastest reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and also help with other environmental goals like cleaner water? And one more thing, how can we have the back of our elected leaders to make sure that they actually implement those policies? And if not, if they don't feel like they can, how can we change that political equation for our leaders?
So I'm happy to answer the first part of that. I think I would toss it back to you, Andrea, on the second part. And I agree that the kind of conversion generally was a really exciting part to see about it, both from converting natural lands to more development, turning croplands into developed areas, as well as making sure that natural habitats like wetlands aren't being converted into farmlands. And also, there's other conversion things that are really interesting, as well as making sure that rangelands and prairies, for example, in the Northern Great Plains, aren't converted into cropland. So there's a lot of emissions associated with this conversion. And so I was excited to see a lot of discussion about those transitions and working to prevent them. I think for me, the other thing that was really exciting to see that there was so much attention to was focusing on the incentives and what is required to get many of these actions to scale. So in terms of thinking about what types of financial incentives, in terms of actually rewarding producers for the climate or other ecosystem services that they're producing, thinking about technical assistance through extension services, as well as kind of R&D. We talked about the feed amendments. Some of those things in the pipeline really need more research and development in terms of getting them up to scale. So there was a lot of focus on that, ranging from things like payments for conservation lands related to climate to other things like crop insurance in different forms than it currently exists that may be more flexible and allowing farmers to tap into that as they shift some of their practices to new forms or to different mixes of crops. So yeah, I think for me, those were the really exciting components, and there were a lot of, I would say, a lot of the kind of cutting edge interventions are mentioned in that. So if you're excited about learning more about what those look like, I think that report contains a lot of these things that both Jessica and I have been talking about.
Yeah, the crop insurance piece is so important. Just as one example, it is chock full of policies for people to get to know. You can nerd out on it. Jessica, did you have anything to add?
I may be a little off topic here, but I'll take it broader, which is that I think there are 4 major levers in making change in this area. So education is a big part of it, policy change is another, and the economics, and as well as financing, and the 4th being innovation and technology. And in various parts of this, both Emily and I have talked about those different areas. You can't make wholesale change without changing people's behaviors, for example. And then on the policy side, I'm most familiar with California. As I showed you that inverted pyramid, I recently read that in the 80s, that pyramid was actually upright like this, which is that the majority of our waste went to the landfill, and actually composting and higher uses, donating food waste was much less prevalent. And what was identified as how we got from this type of pyramid in the 80s to the upside down pyramid that we're at right now is the state legislation. And there are other parts of the country that are progressive as well. I just am much more familiar with California, but legislation that at this point does not, it bans organic material from going to the landfill. It sets goals, progressive goals for different generators of organic waste. It requires that cities have the capabilities in place to allow to provide those services to all of their constituents. I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference. And so without legislation, without policy, and as I showed you, the economics don't always make sense. And so we really need all of those four pieces. Again, education, economics, policy, and innovation, I think all have to come into play.
All right, and that wraps up our time. I just want to say we need more MIT people to run for elected office and work with your elected leaders at the local, state, and federal level. And Environment America is happy to help you. So, all right, Sarah, back to you.
Thank you. It's a fascinating topic to me. I just, being able to compost here in my town has really changed the way I've looked at my extra waste that I make when I have food scraps and things. I think that if we all lived closer to farms, pig farms or regular farms, and we didn't have quite so many regulations about what the animals could eat in terms of food scraps, we probably would be doing much more cycling of the carbon that is in our food. So that's really important. I did at the end there. I thank you all for joining us, and the questions on here were good. I am going to be following up with emails to the people who attended, and in there will be links to the slides. We may be able to have a video link for the recording of this session. I'm not absolutely 100% on that one though. We can, through the EESN, get hold of our speakers with other questions you may have and inquiries. The Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network does have a website. It's available. How will I do this? Let's see, I can put it in a chat or send it in the email. I will send it in the email I respond with. So there's some information about this webinar, about others we've run. The group is now, the network has several groups now working. There are ambassadors in different regions who are trying to collect people nearby about issues they are concerned about. A group down in the DC area is actually looking at advocating for government progress on certain things that will help us reduce warming and protect our environment. So that group is available, MIT Alumni for Climate Action for alums. And they do accept other help too. But we have an ambassador group, and we may be starting up other groups of kind of sub-interests if alums are interested in that. But the website itself will have a lot of information and references. We've been working hard on that this year. So I wanted to thank you, Andrea, for getting us into this very interesting conversation. Emily, again, your information and your grasp of what's happening with the food system is great. And Jessica, it's been a delight to work with you a little on this, and I love the composting idea and getting things back to farms. Make a circular economy of our food and our carbon, that we're part of that ecosystem, and we have to do a better job at it to help preserve our world for the next generations. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and with that, I think let me just check one more QA might be in here. And thank you very much, folks. We will hopefully see you next month. So
thank you.
Very good.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.